This week's reading is from Romans chapter 8, verse 5 to 11. Those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God. You, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, they do not belong to Christ. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks for reading, Joel, and good morning all. It's great that we've been allowed back into the church building. I've got an interesting fact of the week for you all. This is completely true. Churchgoers live longer than non-churchgoers. Now, I can't promise that it works for live stream, but this was a 20-year study, 1992 to 2012, and it had 75,000 participants, so big study. And here's what they found. If you go to church once a week, you have a 26% reduction in death rate. Go to church often, but not quite once a week, then you get a 13% reduction in death rate. But here's the big one. Go to church more than once a week, 33% reduction. So in the test group of 75,000 people, you were 33% less likely to die during the 20-year study if you went to church more than once a week. Now that seems a great time to mention our evening sermon series, which is available on our YouTube channel. 33% reduction. Vava's already working on the marketing campaign. You can hear it, can't you? Go to church, protect your soul, save your life. But before you get too excited, let me just tell you a few things. Firstly, the study only involved women. No idea why that was, but it did. And also, the study didn't compare Christianity to other religions. In fact, there's another study, much smaller, but that study suggests you do a bit better being Jewish or Buddhist rather than being a Christian. But stats like that, they make us pay attention. We want to live longer. And actually, it'd be quite compelling, wouldn't it? Because when you read the gospel accounts, the accounts of Jesus' life, you see him going around and he's healing people, he's bringing people back to life, doing all these miracles. And so you think, well, surely Christians, surely Jesus' followers would live longer. So I dug a bit deeper. There's not actually loads of research, but take cancer survival rates. There's one study which shows that Christians, they have fewer physical symptoms when suffering from cancer. They have a better emotional well-being during treatment. But there was no evidence that cancer survival rates were higher. Now, does that surprise you? Is that a challenge to faith? Particularly given what we've been thinking so far in Romans chapter 8. Tom read this verse for us at the start of the service. Romans 8, verse 2, where we read, "Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death." And so you see the logic. Well, death entered the world as humanity sinned. Sin brings death. And so surely as freedom from sin comes, as Jesus defeats sin and death that first Easter, surely you'd expect there to be evidence for death being defeated in the lives of Christians. But have a look at your life. Ask yourself about your body, whether your body is heading towards life or whether it's heading towards death. The hair that falls out. That's not just me. The joints that ache. The skin that gets thinner and weaker. You and I, we're deathly. From the moment we're born, we're actually heading towards death. And I worry we misunderstand this. So many people have stumbled on this hurdle of faith. Listen to verse 10, which Joel just read for us. This verse is going to be our focus this morning. Verse 10 of Romans chapter 8, where we read, "But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life." Or literally, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. And there are two halves here for us to understand. We've got deathly bodies, but then we've got the Spirit that brings life. So let's be clear on these deathly bodies. You can imagine how it might have played out in the church in Rome as Paul wrote to Christians there. Because we saw last week, Paul, he's just mapped out these two types of humanity. He said that there are people with their minds governed by the flesh. That is the default for each one of us, biased away from God and his law. Or there's the renewed mind. There's the mind governed by the Spirit, the new heart God promises for all who trust in him. So there are two types of people, and there's only two. So when you hear that, what is the obvious question you're asking yourself? Maybe you were asking it last week. You hear this, and you think, well, which am I? Which group am I in? How do I know? How can I be sure? And in verse 6, Paul's already told us. He said, the mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. And suddenly you realize these two different types of people have got two different directions. One group heading towards death, and one group heading towards life. So can you see the concern? As you look at your body, as you see deathliness in your body, it's very easy to say, well, I'm in the wrong group. Or to put it another way, as you look at the deathly circumstances of your life, you tell yourself, well, if only I'd been a better Christian. If I had more faith, God would heal me. If I did better, then God would give me better circumstances. You ever hear yourself saying that? It's very subtle and it's very dangerous. I had a friend, and my friend's mum had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. She was dying. But my friend, she was a Christian, and so she prayed and she prayed. She fasted and she fasted. She was convinced that if she believed enough, if she had enough faith, God would heal her mum. But her mum died. And so my friend, she was devastated. She was spiritually devastated. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. So did my friend have it wrong? Was she in the wrong group? Please don't mishear me here. God can heal, and God does heal. But he won't always do it. And actually, it's into this concern that Paul writes verse 10. We don't want to misunderstand this. Verse 10, if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. The deathliness of your body does not mean that the Spirit is not at work. If you go out tomorrow in your car and you tragically die in a car accident, that does not mean God's Spirit wasn't with you. If coronavirus catches you, it doesn't mean you were less godly. Child born with additional needs. It's because we all live in a world broken by human sin. Broken, deathly bodies are a universal trait of humanity. So yes, there's a promise of life here. We'll think about that in just a moment. But the deathliness of your body doesn't correlate to the deathliness of your spirit. I want us to be really clear on that. Let me say it again. The deathliness of your body doesn't correlate to the deathliness of your spirit. In fact, one of the great joys of the Christian life is that you can have a failing, feeble, deathly body, and yet you can be one of the most alive people on the planet. We're going to think more about that life. Our musicians are serving us wonderfully, putting these videos together, but I have to confess, they do all leave me sad. I can't wait until we're back together again in the building and able to sing praise to God together. That is a wonderful thing when Christians sing praise to their Creator. We'll get there in God's good timing. Now, in the week, I took a walk around our graveyard. That's a good way to remind yourself of your mortality. And as I wandered around, I was just struck that there are hundreds of lives represented in the graveyard, and each life is captured by a few words on the gravestone. And so I was reading some of these words, and they sort of fell into different categories. You've got some inscriptions which spoke of achievement. So there's one gravestone that talks about this person having been a great blessing to the City of London. Some of these inscriptions speak about relationship. So much loved, dearly missed. But actually the ones which made my heart sing the most were the ones that spoke of hope. The ones which say, till we meet again. Or in my Father's house. Or there's one, this was my favourite, it's quoting a verse from the Bible, and it says, the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised. Now when you hear that, maybe it seems unremarkable. We're kind of used to this sort of thing on a gravestone, but actually think about that scene. Think about what it is, because this is the greatest picture of death the world has to offer. It's a gravesite. There's no life there. The grass and the weeds, they might be flourishing, but that's all. Even the stone headstones are beginning to crumble and fall apart. And yet the epitaph reads, the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised. That's pretty extraordinary. But that is what verse 10 of Romans 8 is telling us. We're told if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And as we think about this life, I want to suggest there are two aspects to the life that is being spoken of here. This is resurrection life. This is the Christian hope, the clear teaching of the Bible that one day our graveyard will no longer be a full graveyard. Because for those whom the Spirit gave life to, God will reconstitute their bodies. He will make new resurrection bodies for them. Physical bodies. Don't think of angels or ghosts. This is physical resurrection bodies to live in the physical new earth that he will make. That is the promise. All things new. And when you hear that, it's easy to sort of think, well, that's pie in the sky when you die type territory, isn't it? It's just a vain and empty hope. But that is why Paul writes verse 11. He says, look, if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. He's saying if you're not sure about your resurrection, then have a look at Jesus' resurrection. Ask yourself, did it really happen? That's what we're being encouraged to do, because it's the same Spirit. It's the same life-giving Holy Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead that first Easter Sunday. He will also raise from the dead everyone who has the Spirit of Christ in them. It's Jesus' resurrection which guarantees your resurrection, if your trust is in him. Now, I was remembering back to one Easter Sunday morning, and we'd just been thinking about these. It was at my previous church. We'd been thinking about these things, this resurrection hope. And at the end of the service, we were sharing communion together, bread and wine. And I was standing there giving people bread, and there was one elderly gentleman came forward. He must have been in his 80s. And as I went to give him bread, he had a massive smile on his face, and he leant towards me, and he said, "John, I can't wait for my new body." It was a wonderful moment. He had got it. You see, this feeble, failing, mortal man had this glorious hope because of what Jesus had done for him. He knew he had a body coming which wouldn't perish, spoil, or fade. Do you long for that? As you see the deathliness of your body, do you long for your resurrection body? If Christ is in you, verse 10, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. This is new resurrection life. But I want to say it doesn't stop there. We're going to see this more clearly next week, but this isn't all future hope. The life that is spoken of here, it's not just future life. There's a nowness to this life. And actually, when you think about it, that's got to be true. If the life-giving Spirit lives in you now, what will he be doing? He will be giving you life. That's what life-giving spirits do. The Holy Spirit will be giving you life right now. When I was growing up, every summer holiday, it used to be the same pattern for the Tuckwell family. Without fail, we would load up our Toyota Space Cruiser, which was basically a bit of a box on wheels, and we'd get in the ferry, go across to Calais, and then we'd drive somewhere in Europe to a campsite where we knew there'd be some sunshine. But to get somewhere where you could be sure there's going to be sunshine was always going to be a crazy long journey. And so there were 6, 7, or 8 of us packed into this Toyota Space Cruiser. There was no air conditioning. We were baking hot. And to top it all off, my younger brother, he gets travel sick. So every couple of hours, he would throw up just to sort of encourage us along the way. The journey was awful. But we'd tell ourselves, no, it'll be worth it when we get there. We'll be on the beach soon. I'm pretty sure I've used illustrations like that to describe the Christian life. Trying to show that life might be hard now, but heaven, that the new creation that awaits, that will be great. Well, I want to say, if I've done that here, I'm sorry. Because it's not right. It's only half the story. If you heard that, you'd be left thinking, well, Jesus is great for after I die, but he's pretty useless before then. And it leaves you, I guess, either you're a sort of grin and bear it Christian. I've just got to put up with life now, but there's something good to come later. Or maybe it leaves you thinking, well, if Jesus is good for after I die, I'm going to think about him later in life. I'll worry about him a little bit nearer to death. Make sure that my travel documents for heaven are okay before I die. Let me be really clear, that is not the Christian message. Listen to verse 10 again. This is so much better. We're told, if Christ is in you, that's now, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, that's still now, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. Now. Yes, there's a future hope, but we'll see this more clearly over the next few weeks. There's a nowness to this hope. The life-giving Spirit, if he's living in you, if you've committed your life to follow Jesus, he gives life now. When Jesus came, he said, I have come that you might have life, and life in all its fullness. And that life is not just eternity. He means life now. He meant that there's no better way to live your life now than with his Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God, as your helper. That is the reality here. This is Christ in you. That is totally mind-blowing. There's a survey online asking people which figure from history they would most like to meet face to face. And coming in at number 3 is Plato. Not quite sure how Plato got to number 3. Number 2, Leonardo da Vinci. That's slightly more understandable. But out in front by an absolute country mile is Jesus Christ. People would love to meet him. But for the Christian believer, that is an everyday joy. Christ in you. By his Spirit, he's with you, helping you, guiding you, forgiving you, comforting you. These aren't just abstract truths. This is concrete reality. Over the next few weeks, we're going to see exactly what this looks like in the life of a Christian believer. Please keep tuning in. Feeble, failing, mortal bodies. That is true for each one of us. But a life-giving Spirit, giving a wonderful future hope and giving incredible joy in the here and now. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness.